I was sitting on my back porch with a cold beer, watching the Arizona sunset paint the Phoenix sky in shades of orange and pink, when I saw her marching across my yard like she owned the place. This woman, maybe 55 with that particular haircut that screamed trouble, was heading straight for me with a clipboard clutched to her chest like a shield. I knew immediately this wasn't going to be a friendly neighbor visit. "Excuse me," she called out, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. "Are you Warren Thompson?" I set my beer down on the wooden railing and stood up, already feeling that familiar tension creeping into my shoulders. "That's me. Can I help you?" She stopped about 10 feet from my porch, positioning herself right next to the old chain-link fence that separated my property from the neighbors. The fence was a disaster, rusted and sagging in places, and I'd been meaning to replace it for months. Apparently, I'd waited too long. "I'm Patricia Hendricks, president of the Saguaro Hills Homeowners Association," she announced, tapping her clipboard with a manicured nail. "We need to discuss the condition of this fence. It's an absolute eyesore and it's bringing down property values for the entire neighborhood." I took a deep breath, reminding myself to stay calm. I'd only lived in this subdivision for about 8 months, and this was my first real encounter with the HOA beyond the monthly dues I paid online. "I agree it needs replacing. I've actually been getting quotes from fence companies." Patricia's expression didn't soften one bit. "Well, that's good to hear. According to HOA regulations and Arizona state law regarding shared boundary fences, you and your neighbor, Mrs. Alina Grayson, will need to split the cost 50-50. I've already spoken with Alina, and she's agreed to pay her half. The total estimate from our approved contractor is $8,000, so your portion will be $4,000. We need this completed within 30 days. Something about the way she said it, so matter-of-fact and absolute, made my hackles rise. "Hold on a second. I haven't agreed to use your contractor, and I definitely haven't agreed to pay for half of my neighbor's fence." Patricia's eyes narrowed. "It's not just your fence, Mr. Thompson. It's a boundary fence between two properties. That's how it works. You each own half and you each pay half. The HOA board has already voted on this matter, and you received notice in your email 2 weeks ago." I pulled out my phone and started scrolling through my emails. Sure enough, buried between spam and work messages was something from the Saguaro Hills HOA with the subject line, "Mandatory Fence Replacement Notice." I'd completely missed it. "Look," I said, trying to keep my tone reasonable. "I'm not trying to be difficult, but this fence has been here since before I bought the house. The previous owner told me it was entirely on my property. I maintain it, I'm responsible for it, and I'll replace it when I'm ready." Patricia's face flushed red. "That's absolutely ridiculous. Boundary fences are always shared. I don't care what the previous owner told you. The HOA has records going back 15 years, and this has always been treated as a shared fence. Now, you have 30 days to coordinate with Alina and get this done, or you'll face fines of $100 per day until compliance." She turned on her heel and marched back across my yard before I could respond, leaving me standing there with my blood pressure rising and my peaceful evening completely ruined. I grabbed my beer and drained half of it in one gulp, staring at that damned fence with new eyes. The next morning, I called Alina Grayson. She was a sweet woman in her 70s who'd lived in the neighborhood for over 20 years. When she answered, her voice was apologetic. "Oh, Warren, I'm so sorry about all this," she said. "Patricia came by last week and told me that we had to replace the fence. She said it was required by the HOA and that you'd already agreed to split the cost." My jaw clenched. "She told you I'd already agreed?" "Yes, she was very insistent." She said if we didn't do it voluntarily, we'd both face fines. I'm on a fixed income, Warren. $4,000 is a lot of money for me, but she made it sound like I didn't have a choice. Don't worry about it, Alina. I'm going to figure this out. Can I ask you something? Do you know where the actual property line is between our yards? There was a pause. You know, I always assumed the fence was on the line. But now that you mention it, when my late husband and I moved in back in 2003, the fence was already there. We just inherited whatever the previous owners had set up. After I hung up with Alina, I went straight to my home office and started digging through the paperwork from when I bought the house. The closing documents were in a thick folder in my filing cabinet, and I spread them out on my desk, looking for the property survey. It took me 20 minutes to find it, buried under the title, insurance policy, and inspection reports. The survey was dated from 6 months before I bought the place, done as part of the sale process. I unfolded the large sheet of paper and studied it carefully. My property was a standard rectangular lot, approximately 100 feet wide and 150 feet deep. The boundaries were clearly marked with measurements and bearings. And right there, in black and white, the fence wasn't on the property line at all. According to the survey, the fence was entirely on my property, a full 3 feet inside my boundary line. The actual property line was marked with small metal pins that the surveyor had located and verified. I grabbed a tape measure and headed outside. It was already getting hot, typical for Phoenix in late March, and the sun beat down on me as I searched for the property pins. The one at the front corner near the street was easy to find. A small metal cap set into the ground with the surveyor's identification number stamped on it. I followed the line back toward the rear of my property, pushing through some overgrown bushes on Alina's side. The rear property pin was harder to locate, hidden under years of accumulated leaves and debris. But I found it, and when I stretched my tape measure from the pin to the fence, the measurement confirmed what the survey showed: 3 feet and 2 inches. The fence was entirely on my property. I stood there in the heat, a grin spreading across my face. Patricia Hendricks had just made a very expensive mistake, and she'd done it with all the arrogant confidence of someone who thought she couldn't be wrong. That afternoon, I called a local surveying company. I need a current boundary survey done as soon as possible, I told the receptionist. This is regarding a property dispute with my HOA. She scheduled me for 2 days later, which was faster than I'd hoped. The fee was $1,200, but it would be worth every penny to have official documentation that would hold up in court if it came to that. While I waited for the survey, I decided to do some research on HOA laws in Arizona. I spent hours that evening reading through Arizona Revised Statutes, Title 33, which covered property rights and HOA regulations. What I found was interesting. Arizona law did require adjoining property owners to share the cost of boundary fences, but only if the fence was actually on the boundary line. If the fence was entirely on one person's property, that person had full ownership and all responsibility for it. They also had the exclusive right to decide what to do with it. I also discovered that HOAs in Arizona had to follow specific procedures when assessing fines or requiring property improvements. They were required to provide written notice with detailed explanations, hold hearings if requested, and couldn't just arbitrarily impose penalties without due process. Patricia's 30-day ultimatum and threat of immediate fines were likely not legally enforceable. Armed with this information, I drafted a formal letter to the HOA board. I explained that I had documentation showing the fence was entirely on my property, that I would be obtaining a current survey to confirm this, and that I would not be splitting any costs with my neighbor. I stated that any attempt to fine me would be met with legal action. I kept the tone professional but firm, printed 3 copies, and sent one via certified mail to the HOA management company, one to Patricia Hendricks personally, and kept one for my records. 2 days later, the surveyor showed up right on time. His name was Miguel Rodriguez, and he'd been doing boundary surveys in the Phoenix area for 15 years. He arrived with an assistant and enough equipment to make it clear this was going to be a thorough job. "So you're having a dispute with your HOA about this fence?" Miguel asked as he set up his total station near the front of my property. "Yeah, they're trying to force me to split the replacement cost with my neighbor, but my closing survey shows it's entirely on my property." Miguel nodded, adjusting his tripod. "I see that a lot, actually. People just assume boundary fences are on the boundary, but that's not always the case. Sometimes one owner builds it entirely on their land to avoid dealing with the neighbor. Sometimes the boundary line shifts over the years due to errors in old surveys. We'll get you the truth." I watched as Miguel and his assistant worked methodically across my property, using GPS equipment and traditional surveying tools to locate the original boundary pins and verify their positions. They spent extra time on the rear corners, clearing vegetation and digging carefully to expose the pins without disturbing them. Around noon, Alina came out of her house and walked over to where I was standing in my driveway. "What's all this about?" she asked, though she didn't sound upset, just curious. "Getting an official survey done," I explained. "I want to confirm exactly where the property line is before I do anything about that fence." Her eyes widened with understanding. "You don't think it's on the line, do you?" "My closing survey shows it's not, but I want current documentation to make sure." Alina glanced over at the fence, then back at me. "Warren, if that fence is entirely on your property, then I've been benefiting from it all these years without paying anything. That doesn't seem right." "Alina, you didn't know, and neither did I until Patricia started making demands. Don't worry about it. The fence is old and needs replacing anyway. I just want to make sure I'm not being railroaded into paying for something that's not my responsibility." She patted my arm. "That Patricia is something else. She tried the same thing with Bill Henderson 3 years ago, wanted him to repaint his house in colors she approved. He fought her and won, but it took months and cost him a fortune in lawyer fees." That was not encouraging news, but I filed it away for future reference. Bill Henderson might be a good person to talk to. Miguel finished up around 3 in the afternoon. He called me over to where he was packing up his equipment. "Want to see the preliminary results?" "Absolutely." He pulled out a tablet and showed me a digital overlay of his survey data on an aerial photograph of my property. The boundary lines were marked in bright red, and the fence line was marked in yellow. Just as I'd suspected, the fence was clearly inside my property line. "How far inside am I looking at?" I asked. Miguel zoomed in on the image and used a measurement tool. "Varies slightly from front to back, but averages 3 feet 1 inch. The fence is definitely entirely on your property." "I'll have the full written survey with all measurements and certifications ready in 3 to 5 business days." "That's perfect. Thanks, Miguel." He nodded and shook my hand. "Good luck with your HOA. From what I've seen, you've got a solid case. That fence is yours to do with as you please." After Miguel left, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. I had the truth now, documented and certified. Patricia Hendricks was wrong, and I had the proof. I decided to celebrate with a nice dinner, so I drove over to a local steakhouse and treated myself to a ribeye and a good bourbon. When I got home around 8 that evening, there was a notice taped to my front door. It was printed on official HOA letterhead, and my good mood evaporated as I read it. Notice of violation, property address, 2847 Desert Bloom Drive. Violation: failure to comply with mandatory fence replacement order dated March 18, 2026. Fine: $100 per day commencing April 18, 2026. You have the right to request a hearing before the HOA board. Requests must be submitted in writing within 10 days of this notice. Signed, Patricia Hendricks, HOA President. I crumpled the notice in my fist, then forced myself to smooth it back out. Getting angry wouldn't help. I needed to play this smart. I went inside, scanned the notice into my computer, and started drafting a hearing request. I cited the Arizona HOA statutes regarding proper notice and due process, attached a copy of my original closing survey, and stated that I would be providing additional documentation proving the fence was entirely my property. The next morning, I dropped off the hearing request at the HOA management company's office in person. The receptionist, a young woman named Jessica, took it with an apologetic smile. "Patricia's been pretty intense about this fence situation," she said quietly. "She's convinced she's right." "Well, she's not," I said, "and I've got the surveys to prove it." Over the next week, I prepared my case like I was going to trial. I made multiple copies of both surveys, highlighted the relevant measurements, and created a simple diagram showing how the fence was positioned relative to the property line. I also printed out the relevant sections of Arizona law regarding fence ownership and HOA procedures. I called Bill Henderson, the neighbor Alina had mentioned, and invited him for coffee. We met at a local cafe, and Bill turned out to be a stocky guy in his 60s with a thick gray beard and a no-nonsense attitude. "Patricia Hendricks is a menace," he said bluntly, stirring sugar into his coffee. "She thinks being HOA president makes her the queen of the neighborhood. When she came after me about my house colors, she claimed the HOA had authority to dictate exact paint colors, even though our CC and Artiques only said earth tones. I had to hire a lawyer and spend 6 months fighting her before the board finally voted to override her." "Did you win any money back?" I asked. Bill shook his head. "No. Arizona law makes it hard to recover attorney fees from HOAs unless you can prove they acted in bad faith or violated specific statutes. I was just glad to be done with it. My advice: document everything, stay calm, and don't let her bully you. She counts on people giving up rather than fighting." The hearing was scheduled for April 10th, a Thursday evening at 7 o'clock in the subdivision's community center. I arrived 15 minutes early with a folder full of documentation and a small knot of anxiety in my stomach. Despite my preparation, I knew Patricia wasn't going to back down easily. The community center was a low, stucco building with a Spanish tile roof, typical of Phoenix architecture. Inside, the main room had been set up with a long table at the front for the board members and several rows of folding chairs for attendees. A handful of other residents were scattered around the room, probably there for their own issues or just to watch the drama. Patricia was already seated at the center of the board table, flanked by 4 other board members. I recognized 2 of them from neighborhood events: Jim Wilson, a retired accountant who served as treasurer, and Sandra Kim, a real estate agent who was the secretary. The other 2 were strangers to me. Patricia glanced up as I entered and her expression hardened. "Mr. Thompson, please have a seat. We'll begin shortly." I chose a seat in the second row, close enough to be heard clearly but not so close as to seem confrontational. Alina slipped in a few minutes later and gave me an encouraging smile before sitting near the back. At 7 o'clock sharp, Patricia called the meeting to order. "This hearing concerns a violation notice issued to Warren Thompson of 2847 Desert Bloom Drive regarding failure to comply with a mandatory fence replacement order. Mr. Thompson has requested this hearing to dispute the violation. Mr. Thompson, you may present your case. I stood and walked forward, placing my folder on a small podium that had been set up for speakers. Thank you. I requested this hearing because the fence replacement order is based on a false premise. The HOA has claimed that the fence between my property and 2845 Desert Bloom Drive is a boundary fence jointly owned by myself and Alina Grayson, and that we must split the replacement cost. This is incorrect. I pulled out the first survey and held it up. This is the property survey conducted during the sale of my home in August 2025. As you can see, the fence is located approximately 3 feet inside my property line. It is not on the boundary. Patricia leaned forward. That survey is outdated and irrelevant. Boundary fences are treated as shared property regardless of their exact position. That's standard practice. Actually, it's not, I replied calmly. Arizona Revised Statute 33-1304 specifies that adjoining owners share responsibility for boundary fences only when the fence is actually on the boundary line. If a fence is entirely on one person's property, that person has sole ownership and responsibility. I handed out copies of the statute to each board member. Furthermore, I've commissioned a current boundary survey to eliminate any question about the fence's location. That survey was completed last week, and it confirms the same measurements. I distributed copies of Miguel's survey, watching as the board members studied the documents. Jim Wilson, the treasurer, looked particularly interested, running his finger along the measurement lines and comparing them to the aerial photograph. Patricia's face had gone red. This is ridiculous. The fence has been maintained as a shared fence for decades. You can't just suddenly claim sole ownership because of some technical detail about where the line falls. It's not a technical detail, I said, keeping my voice level. It's the actual legal definition of ownership. The fence is on my property. I paid for the property. The fence belongs to me. Sandra Kim, the secretary, spoke up. Mr. Thompson, even if what you're saying is legally accurate, wouldn't it be neighborly to work something out with Mrs. Grayson? The fence does benefit both properties. I have no issue with Mrs. Grayson, I said. In fact, I've spoken with her several times and she understands the situation. My dispute is with the HOA trying to force me into a financial obligation that isn't mine. If I choose to replace the fence, I'll do so on my timeline and with my choice of contractor. The HOA doesn't have the authority to mandate that I pay for half of anything. Patricia stood up, her chair scraping loudly against the floor. The HOA absolutely has the authority to require maintenance that affects property values and community standards. That's in our CC and Articus, which you agreed to when you bought your house. Show me where in the CC and Articus it says you can force me to pay for improvements on my own property, I challenged. Patricia grabbed a thick binder and started flipping through pages. The room fell silent except for the rustle of paper. After a minute, she stopped and read aloud. Section 7.3. The HOA board may require property owners to maintain their properties in good condition and may assess costs for improvements that benefit the community. That section applies to common areas and shared structures, Jim Wilson interjected, looking up from the survey documents. I'm looking at our CC and Articus right now, Patricia, and there's nothing that gives us authority to dictate how an owner manages structures entirely on their own property, as long as they meet county codes and aesthetic guidelines. Patricia turned on him. Are you seriously taking his side? I'm not taking sides, Jim said firmly. I'm reading what our governing documents actually say. Mr. Thompson has provided 2 professional surveys showing the fence is on his property. Unless you have evidence to the contrary, I don't see how we can force him to split costs with his neighbor. One of the other board members, a thin man with glasses whom I later learned was named Robert Martinez, cleared his throat. I think Jim is right. This seems like a property rights issue, and we need to be very careful about overstepping our authority. If Mr. Thompson has documentation that the fence is his, then it's his decision what to do with it. Patricia looked like she was about to explode. This is setting a terrible precedent. If we let owners just do whatever they want, the whole neighborhood will fall apart. No one's saying he can do whatever he wants, Sandra Kim said diplomatically. We're saying he has the right to manage his own property as he sees fit, within the rules we actually have authority to enforce. The fence is ugly and should be replaced, but we can't force him to split the cost if it's not a shared fence. The 5th board member, an older woman named Dorothy Chen, finally spoke. I move that we rescind the violation notice and the associated fines. Mr. Thompson has provided sufficient evidence that the fence is entirely on his property, and therefore he has sole discretion over its maintenance and replacement. I second the motion, Jim Wilson said immediately, Patricia's hands clenched into fists. This is outrageous. I'm the president of this board, and I'm telling you this is wrong. Being president doesn't mean you get to override proper procedure or ignore evidence, Jim said. All in favor of rescinding the violation. Jim, Dorothy, Robert, and Sandra all raised their hands. Patricia remained rigid, her hand firmly down. Motion carries 4-1, Jim announced. Mr. Thompson, the violation notice is rescinded and you won't be fined. You're free to handle the fence situation as you see fit. Relief washed over me, but I kept my expression neutral. Thank you. I appreciate the board taking the time to review the evidence. Patricia gathered her papers with jerky, angry movements. This meeting is adjourned, she snapped, and stormed out of the room without another word. Several residents came up to me afterward to congratulate me. One couple, the Johnsons, told me they'd had their own run-ins with Patricia and were glad to see someone stand up to her successfully. Alina gave me a hug and thanked me for handling everything fairly. You didn't have to fight for me, she said. I know Patricia was pushing me to pay, but I would have understood if you'd just let it go. It wasn't about the money, Alina, I told her. It was about what was right. Patricia can't just push people around because she thinks she knows better than everyone else. Over the next few days, things seemed to settle down. I started getting quotes from fence contractors, planning to replace the old chain link with a nice block wall that would actually look good and last for decades. The quotes ranged from $6,000 to $10,000, depending on the height and style. I settled on a mid-range option, a 6-foot block wall with stucco finish, painted to match my house, for $7,800. I mentioned to Alina that once the wall was up, she'd benefit from the privacy and aesthetics just as much as I would, even though it was entirely on my property. She insisted on contributing something, and we eventually agreed that she'd pay for half the cost of having the contractor add a gate that would allow her easy access to the front of her property. It was a fair compromise that didn't involve any forced cost splitting. About a week after the hearing, I received an email from Jim Wilson. He apologized for the way Patricia had handled the situation and mentioned that several board members were concerned about her increasingly aggressive approach to HOA management. He asked if I'd be willing to attend the next general board meeting to observe, hinting that there might be some significant changes coming. I agreed, curious about what was brewing. The general meeting was scheduled for May 1st, and when I arrived at the community center that evening, the room was packed. Apparently, word had spread about my dispute with Patricia, and other residents were coming out of the woodwork with their own complaints. Patricia called the meeting to order, but her usual commanding presence seemed shaken. As the meeting progressed, several residents stood up during the public comment period to air grievances. One family had been threatened with fines for painting their front door, a color Patricia deemed inappropriate, even though it was a shade of brown clearly within the allowed palette. Another resident had been ordered to remove a decorative fountain because Patricia thought it was tacky. Despite there being no rule against lawn ornaments, Jim Wilson waited until all the comments were finished, then stood and addressed the room. I think it's clear that we have a serious problem with how our HOA has been operating. I'm not blaming anyone specifically, but we've lost sight of what an HOA is supposed to do. We're here to maintain common areas, preserve property values, and enforce reasonable rules that everyone agreed to. We're not here to micromanage every aspect of how people live in their own homes. There was a murmur of agreement from the audience. Patricia's face had gone pale. Therefore, Jim continued, I'm making a motion that we conduct a full review of all violation notices issued in the past year and rescind any that were based on rules not explicitly supported by our CC and Articus, or that were enforced inconsistently. Sandra Kim seconded the motion, and after a brief discussion, it passed 4-1 again with only Patricia voting against. Then Dorothy Chen stood. I have another motion. Given the concerns raised tonight about HOA overreach and the pattern of aggressive enforcement we've seen, I move that we schedule a special election for all board positions to be held within 60 days. This will give the community a chance to decide if they want new leadership. The room erupted in applause. Patricia jumped to her feet. You can't do this. I was elected to a 3-year term. This is a coup. It's not a coup, Robert Martinez said quietly. It's democracy. The bylaws allow for special elections if a majority of the board votes for one. This is all perfectly legal. The motion passed, again 4-1. Patricia grabbed her belongings and left without another word, and I had the distinct feeling she wouldn't be running for re-election. The special election happened on June 15th. I didn't run for the board myself, but I did attend the candidates forum and voted for people who seemed reasonable and level-headed. Patricia did run again, but she was soundly defeated, receiving only 18 votes out of 230 ballots cast. Jim Wilson was elected as the new president, with Sandra Kim remaining as secretary and several new faces joining the board. As for my fence, the contractor started work in mid-May. The old chain link came down in a single day, hauled away in a truck. Over the next week, the crew dug footings, laid block, and built a beautiful new wall that transformed the look of both my yard and Alina's. The gate we'd added for her convenience was a nice touch, wrought iron with a decorative spiral pattern. Alina made cookies to thank the work crew and brought over a batch for me too. This wall is beautiful, Warren. Thank you for fighting this the right way. A lot of people would have just given in or gotten nasty about it. I just don't like being pushed around, I said with a shrug. And I definitely don't like people abusing whatever little bit of authority they have. The wall cost me exactly $7,800, plus Alina's $500 contribution for the gate. If I'd given in to Patricia's demands, I would have paid $4,000 for a fence I didn't even get to choose, using a contractor I'd never vetted. Instead, I got exactly what I wanted, proved my property rights, and helped trigger a change in HOA leadership that benefited the entire neighborhood. But the story didn't quite end there. About 3 weeks after the wall was finished, I was mowing my front lawn when a sedan pulled up, and a man in business casual clothes stepped out. He introduced himself as Derek Mills, an attorney representing Patricia Hendricks. "Mr. Thompson, my client believes you defamed her character during the dispute over the fence. She's prepared to file a lawsuit unless you're willing to make a public apology and pay $20,000 in damages." I turned off the lawnmower and stared at him. "You've got to be kidding me." Derek handed me a letter. "I assure you, I'm quite serious. My client's reputation has been damaged by your accusations that she overstepped her authority. Several people have told her directly that they voted against her in the election because of your campaign against her." "I didn't run any campaign," I said, scanning the letter. It was full of legal jargon but basically said what Derek had already told me. "I defended my property rights with documented evidence. Everything I said was true and provable." "Truth is a defense against defamation." "Certainly," Derek said in a tone that suggested he thought I was an idiot for bringing it up. "But my client believes she can demonstrate that you acted with malice and intended to harm her standing in the community." I folded the letter and handed it back to him. "Tell your client that if she files this lawsuit, I'll countersue for harassment and abuse of process. I have documentation of everything that happened, including witness testimony that she lied to my neighbor about me agreeing to cost sharing before I'd ever been properly notified. I also have recordings of the HOA meetings where the board overrode her 4-1 because she was so clearly in the wrong." Derek's confident expression faltered slightly. "You recorded the meetings. Arizona is a one-party consent state for recordings," I said. "I recorded every conversation I had regarding this dispute, and the HOA meetings are technically public forums anyway. If Patricia wants to open discovery on this, I've got hours of material showing a pattern of her abusing her HOA position." Derek was quiet for a moment, then took the letter back. "I'll relay your response to my client." I never heard from him again. Apparently, Patricia decided that suing me wasn't worth the risk of having all her HOA behavior examined in court. Life in Saguaro Hills settled into a comfortable routine after that. The new HOA board under Jim Wilson's leadership was fair and reasonable, focusing on actual community needs rather than petty power trips. They repaved the neighborhood streets, renovated the community pool, and organized a summer barbecue that actually brought neighbors together instead of driving them apart. I got to know more of my neighbors, including Bill Henderson, who became a good friend. We'd meet for beers occasionally and swap stories about dealing with bureaucratic nonsense. Alina continued to be a sweet neighbor, and she loved the new wall, particularly the gate that made it easy for her to access her front yard without walking all the way around. About 6 months after everything settled, I was out working in my yard when a young couple walked by with a toddler in a stroller. They stopped and introduced themselves as the Washburns, new residents who just bought a house 3 streets over. "We heard about you," the husband said with a grin. "You're the guy who stood up to the crazy HOA president." I laughed. "Word gets around, huh?" "Oh yeah," the wife said. "When we were doing our due diligence before buying, we researched the HOA. Saw all the drama from last year, but also saw that the board completely turned over and everything's been smooth since then. That's actually why we felt comfortable buying here. Knowing the community can police itself when leadership goes bad, that's important." It was strange to think that my fence dispute had become part of the neighborhood's reputation. But I supposed it was better to be known for standing up for property rights than for rolling over and accepting whatever demands came down from on high. One afternoon in early October, I was putting away some yard tools in my garage when a leaner came over with a thoughtful expression. "Warren, I wanted to ask you something. I've been thinking about selling my house and moving closer to my daughter in Flagstaff. Would you be interested in buying it?" I was surprised but intrigued. "I don't know, Eleanor. What would I do with two houses? You could rent it out or sell it for a profit eventually, or maybe you have family who'd want to live next door," she smiled. "I just thought I'd offer it to you first, since you've been such a good neighbor and since technically 3 feet of my yard is actually yours anyway." I laughed at that. We'd never bothered to formally adjust the property line since it didn't really matter in practical terms, but she had a point. "Let me think about it," I said. "What are you asking?" We talked numbers, and Eleanor's asking price was reasonable, maybe even a little low for the Phoenix market. Over the next few days, I crunched the numbers and realized that buying her house as a rental property actually made good financial sense. The rental market in Phoenix was strong, and having a property right next door would make management easy. I made Eleanor an offer she accepted, and by December we'd closed on the sale. I spent January renovating her old house, updating the kitchen and bathrooms, and by February I had it rented to a nice family with 2 kids. The rental income more than covered the mortgage, and I had the satisfaction of knowing that I was now the proud owner of 2 houses and the fence between them. Patricia Hendricks moved out of the neighborhood in March, though I only heard about it secondhand. Apparently, she'd become so uncomfortable with her loss of status and influence that she decided to start fresh somewhere else. I didn't wish her any ill will, but I certainly didn't miss her presence. The fence that had started all the trouble stood strong and beautiful, a 6-foot block wall that clearly belonged to me and served both properties well. Every time I looked at it, I was reminded of the importance of standing up for yourself, doing your research, and not letting bullies push you around just because they have a title and a clipboard. Jim Wilson and I developed a good working relationship, and he occasionally asked my advice on HOA matters since I'd been through the fire and come out the other side. I even joined a committee focused on reviewing and updating the neighborhood's CC and Articus to make them clearer and less subject to interpretation or abuse. One evening in late April, almost exactly a year after the whole mess started, I was back on my porch with a beer, watching another Arizona sunset paint the sky in brilliant colors. My new tenant, a guy named Carlos, waved from next door as he got his kids ready for bed. The neighborhood was peaceful, the HOA was functioning properly, and my property rights were secure. I raised my beer in a silent toast to that stupid old chain-link fence that had started everything. Sometimes the biggest battles come from the smallest things, but fighting them the right way, with evidence and principle rather than emotion and ego, makes all the difference. The wall stood strong, a monument to property rights, good surveying, and the fundamental truth that just because someone has authority doesn't mean they have the right to abuse it. And every time I looked at it, I felt a deep satisfaction knowing that I'd done things the right way and won not just for myself, but for everyone in the neighborhood who'd been dealing with Patricia's overreach. Life in Saguaro Hills went on, quieter and more harmonious than before. The community pool renovation was completed in May, and the HOA threw a grand reopening party that drew almost every resident. Kids splashed in the water while adults mingled around barbecue grills, and there was a genuine sense of community that had been missing during Patricia's reign. Bill Henderson cornered me by the potato salad table. "You know what the difference is now," he said, gesturing around at the happy crowd. "People actually like living here again. When Patricia was in charge, Everyone was afraid to do anything because they didn't know what arbitrary rules she'd enforce next. Now we've got actual leadership that makes sense. I had to agree. Jim Wilson had proven to be an excellent HOA president, focusing on genuine community needs and improvements rather than petty enforcement actions. The board had even revised the fine structure to make it more reasonable and ensure that fines were truly a last resort after multiple warnings and opportunities to remedy issues. But perhaps the most satisfying development came in July. I was checking my mail one afternoon when I found an official-looking envelope from the Maricopa County Attorney's office. My heart skipped a beat as I opened it, wondering what could possibly be wrong now. The letter inside was an inquiry, not an accusation. The county attorney's office was investigating several complaints filed against Patricia Hendricks regarding her time as HOA president. Specifically, they were looking into whether she had misappropriated HOA funds, accepted kickbacks from the contractors she'd favored, and violated Arizona's HOA regulations regarding board member conduct. The letter asked if I would be willing to provide testimony and documentation regarding my interactions with Patricia and the HOA board during the fence dispute. I called the number listed on the letterhead and spoke with an assistant attorney general named Lisa Chen. "Mr. Thompson, thank you for calling back so quickly," she said. "We've received multiple complaints about Ms. Hendricks' conduct as HOA president, and your case came up repeatedly as an example of her overstepping authority. We're trying to determine if there's a pattern of behavior that rises to the level of criminal misconduct." Criminal? I was surprised. I thought it was just an abuse of power, not necessarily illegal. "That's what we're investigating," Lisa explained. "We've subpoenaed HOA financial records and found some irregularities. The contractor she wanted to force you to use, for example, paid her a $1,500 consulting fee the month before she issued your violation notice. She received similar payments from several other vendors the HOA has used over the past 3 years. "That's a kickback," I said flatly. "Potentially, yes. In Arizona, HOA board members have a fiduciary duty to act in the best interests of the community, not their personal financial interests. If we can prove she was steering business to specific contractors in exchange for payments, that's a violation of state law." I agreed to provide whatever documentation and testimony they needed. Over the next several weeks, I had multiple conversations with Lisa and her investigative team. I provided copies of all my surveys, recordings of HOA meetings, emails, and a detailed timeline of everything that had happened. The investigation expanded beyond just my case. It turned out that Patricia had been running similar schemes throughout her tenure as HOA president. She'd forced homeowners to use specific landscapers, painters, and contractors, all of whom were paying her under-the-table fees. She'd also been approving inflated invoices for common area maintenance and pocketing the difference. In total, the investigation estimated she'd taken over $40,000 in kickbacks and fraudulent billing over 3 years. In September, she was formally charged with fraud, theft, and violation of HOA statutes. The case made local news, and several Phoenix television stations ran stories about HOA corruption. I was interviewed by one local reporter, a sharp woman named Jennifer Hayes, who did a piece on the dangers of unchecked HOA authority. I kept my comments measured and focused on the systemic issues rather than personal attacks on Patricia. "The problem isn't just one bad president," I said on camera. "It's that HOAs can have enormous power over people's homes and lives, but there's often very little oversight. Homeowners need to pay attention to what their boards are doing. ask questions, and not be afraid to push back when something doesn't seem right. The story aired during the evening news and got picked up by a few national outlets that were doing broader pieces on HOA issues. For a few days, I fielded calls from reporters and other homeowners around the country who'd had their own HOA nightmares. It was eye-opening to realize how common these problems were. Patricia's trial was scheduled for November. The evidence against her was overwhelming, and her attorney advised her to take a plea deal. In exchange for pleading guilty to reduced charges, she agreed to pay full restitution to the HOA, perform 200 hours of community service, and serve 18 months of probation. She'd also never be allowed to serve on an HOA board again. The restitution came to $42,000, which was distributed back to homeowners who'd been overcharged or forced to use her preferred contractors. Alina received a check for $1,200, money she'd paid to one of Patricia's kickback landscapers for work that had been priced too high. I received $800, representing the inflated estimates Patricia had used when trying to force me to replace the fence. Jim Wilson, as HOA president, issued a formal apology to the community on behalf of the board. "We failed in our oversight responsibilities," he wrote in a letter to all homeowners. "We should have been paying closer attention to financial matters and questioning decisions that seemed arbitrary or excessive. We've implemented new financial controls and transparency measures to ensure this never happens again." The new measures included quarterly financial reports sent to all homeowners, mandatory competitive bidding for any contract over $5,000, and a requirement that board members recuse themselves from any vote involving a contractor they had a financial relationship with. By December, life in Saguaro Hills had truly returned to normal. The HOA was functioning properly, the neighborhood looked good, and people felt secure in their homes. My fence still stood strong, now a symbol not just of property rights but of what could happen when residents refused to be bullied and held their leaders accountable. I spent Christmas Day with Alina before she moved to Flagstaff. We had dinner at a nice restaurant and reminisced about the crazy year we'd been through. "You know," she said over dessert, "when Patricia first came to me about that fence, I was terrified. I thought I'd lose my home if I didn't comply. But watching you stand up to her, seeing how you used facts and documentation rather than just getting angry, that taught me something important." "What's that?" I asked. "That scared isn't the same as powerless. We always have more options than we think we do, even when someone in authority is trying to intimidate us." She raised her glass of wine. "Here's to fences, property lines, and standing up for what's right." I clinked my glass against hers. "I'll drink to that." Alina moved to Flagstaff in early January, and I helped her load the moving truck. She was excited to be closer to her daughter and grandchildren, and I was happy for her. My tenants next door were working out well, and the rental income was a nice supplement to my regular job as an engineer. In February, almost 2 years after I'd first moved to Saguaro Hills, I found myself back on my porch with a beer, looking at the fence that had changed everything. It was a good fence, solid and attractive, serving its purpose of marking my property line and providing privacy. But more than that, it was a reminder of an important lesson. Your property rights matter, documentation beats intimidation, and communities are better off when people stand up to petty tyrants. A car pulled up in front of my house, and I saw Jim Wilson get out. He walked up my driveway with a 6-pack of beer and a grin. "Thought you might want some company," he said. "Always," I replied, gesturing to the empty chair next to me. We sat there as the sun went down, talking about neighborhood business, upcoming projects, and how far Sagaro Hills had come in the past year. The HOA had become what it was supposed to be, a tool for maintaining and improving the community, not a weapon for one person's ego or enrichment. "You know what's funny," Jim said, popping open his second beer. "People still talk about the fence dispute. It's become part of the neighborhood's history. New residents hear the story, and it actually makes them more confident about living here because they know the community can correct course when things go wrong." "That's good," I said. "Every neighborhood should have at least one story about standing up to bullies." We sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the lights come on in houses across the subdivision. Families were having dinner, kids were doing homework, people were living their lives without fear of arbitrary rules or corrupt leadership. That's what a neighborhood should be. The fence stood in the growing darkness, solid and sure, entirely on my property and entirely my responsibility, exactly as it should be. And I wouldn't have had it any other way. As the evening grew cooler, Jim and I talked about the upcoming HOA projects for the year. There was talk of adding some new playground equipment to the community park, updating the landscaping along the main entrance, and possibly organizing a neighborhood watch program. These were the kinds of things an HOA should focus on, improvements that genuinely benefited everyone rather than arbitrary enforcement of personal preferences. "We're also thinking about putting together a welcome packet for new residents," Jim said. "Something that clearly explains their rights as homeowners, how the HOA actually works, and who to contact if they have questions or concerns. Too many people move into HOA neighborhoods without really understanding what they're getting into." "That's a great idea," I said. "If I'd known more about HOA law when Patricia first approached me, I might have handled things even more efficiently." "You handled it perfectly," Jim countered. "You stayed calm, did your research, got documentation, and followed proper procedures. That's the textbook way to deal with any bureaucratic overreach." We finished our beers as the last light faded from the sky. Jim headed home, and I went inside, feeling content with how everything had turned out. The fence dispute had been stressful and time-consuming, but it had also been worth fighting. I'd protected my property rights, helped reform a corrupt HOA, and become part of a stronger, more aware community in the process. The wall between my property and what had been Aliner's property stood strong, a testament to the importance of knowing your rights and standing up for them. Every time I looked at it, I was reminded that the biggest battles often start with the smallest things, and that victory comes to those who are prepared, persistent, and principled. In the end, it wasn't just about a fence at all. It was about refusing to be bullied, about the importance of documentation and evidence, and about how communities can heal and improve when residents engage with their HOA rather than just passively accepting whatever comes down from board. Patricia had learned an expensive lesson about abusing authority, and the neighborhood had learned the value of accountability and oversight. As I settled into bed that night, I felt genuinely grateful for how everything had worked out. My home was my castle, my fence was my fence, and my neighborhood was a place where people looked out for each other and held their leaders accountable. That was worth far more than the $7,800 I'd spent on the wall, or the hours I'd invested in fighting Patricia's overreach. Sometimes life throws unexpected challenges at you. Sometimes those challenges come in the form of a middle-aged woman with a clipboard and an inflated sense of authority. But if you handle them right, if you stay calm and let facts do the talking, you can win not just your own battle but make things better for everyone around you. And that's exactly what had happened in Sagaro Hills. The fence stood strong, The HOA ran properly, and I slept soundly knowing that my property was mine and that justice had prevailed. In the end, that's all anyone can really ask for.